Well, in the age of Twitter and shameless self-promotion, it's become significantly easier to market yourself as a brand and develop a public persona. But there are both risks and opportunities associated with building a highly visible profile while still trying to balance the reputation of your employer. For more, we're joined by independent communication strategist Sarah Britton, and from Cape Town, brand specialist Jenny Handley joins our conversation as well. Welcome to you both, and let's start off, Sarah, with you at the desk. Why should I care about building a personal brand?
Because we live in an age of intense competition, and as Tom Peters wrote back in 1997 already, this is the age of the individual, and the most important job in your life is to be CEO of Me Inc. You are the marketing manager of your own personal brand.
Taking a look at how much you have in your control, how much without, is it more in favor of you having control or not?
It's a lot more in favor of you having control now, thanks to social media. And Tom was writing back before we had Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, any of those channels that made it possible for brands to create brands. And now all of us have access to an audience. And once you have access to an audience, you can start to build your brand, to create people who care about what you have to say. So it's a lot easier, and it has muddied the water to an extent, because we are seeing a case where employer brands and personal brands are sometimes in conflict with each other.
Jenny, are South Africans in general as cognizant of this as they should be?
I don't think they are. I think some people who take themselves seriously and look at themselves as a business, as you were saying, make the effort to then put a plan in place. But I do think in many other countries, they are more aggressive about building their brand. And it could be linked to confidence being considered as arrogance. People who are brave enough to believe in themselves and get out there and market themselves are sometimes considered to be arrogant, because you are really building your visibility. However, if you're confident about the value that you're giving, there's nothing wrong with building that visibility and raising your profile.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I'll give you a perfect example. I mean, Garth's a nice guy, but you know, Garth is probably more famous in the last 6 months for writing a column on why Cape Townians are douchebags, and allowing that to go viral in social media than necessarily his interview with Kevin Hedderwick a couple of weeks back. You know, Kevin Hedderwick had obviously been the guy who founded Famous Brands. And the first time I saw the headline go up of all Cape Townians are douchebags, you know, I thought, well, you know, now here's somebody representing my brand. Yes, it was fantastic. It was a really good read. It was fun, and you can go and Google the blog. I mean, it's a really fantastic read, and it's still 6 months down the line, generating a lot of conversation about it. But you know, as the editor, I've got to think, you know, what does that say about my brand? Yes, he's standing out there. Yes, he stands for something. And it's just an interesting trade-off to say, well, you know, do I let Garth be Garth, or do I let Garth kind of conform to the box that he's got there? And you know, ultimately, the decision was, Garth's building his brand. People will like him or hate him, whatever it is, but they will associate certain virtues or attributes.
How's that working out for you, Garth?
I've always been way better at causing trouble than being good. So, but what I want to ask the brand specialist is, I mean, I think it's important to be a brand, because if you're not a brand, you just Joe Soap like everyone else, and you don't stand out, and I guess you can't charge a premium for your services, you don't get noticed, etc. But I also want to ask, you know, two questions. One, how many brands personal brands can South Africa really accommodate? Quite a small market. Mark and I were moaning earlier on about how, well, maybe it was mainly me just moaning, Mark listening, but you know, South Africa tends to have its little, you know, certain people pop up and create very successful brands, and they kind of get recycled, you know, between all the businesses. People are often loath to take a chance on a new person popping up. And then the other thing, the more crucial thing, is how do you distinguish the brand from the BS? And what I mean by that is, as a journalist, you often sort of speak to people who have positioned themselves as these experts on certain fields, and after a bit of interrogation, you realize they don't actually know all that much. And I just wonder, yet these people are charging huge amounts of money to,
and that's so true, because you've got social platforms like Twitter, like Facebook, allowing you the ability to do just that.
Well, there was a phase, thankfully it's over now, where every second person on Twitter was calling themselves a social media guru.
Digital ninja.
Yeah, digital ninja. Oh, I hate that. And we've seen a big backlash against that. And one of the advantages with social media, and where I think it's good for people, is that we don't actually like the BS. We don't like fake people. There's this great new trend that came out last year called flawsome, which is this horrible portmanteau of flawed and awesome. But you're seeing this interesting situation where brands are trying to be more like people, because we forgive people. If we know you, we like you, we understand. Yes, sometimes you're going to write that Cape Townians are douchebags, but you're also going to interview Kevin Hedderwick. And we understand that you're a person, that you are complex, and that just because you do one thing doesn't mean you can't do another. And that's a huge advantage, because it means that somebody like me, who's an independent strategist, but also does a lot of writing, I do art, I do a lot of different things, and I'm faced with this challenge all the time, that my writer brand, the expectations of readers are not necessarily aligned with the expectations of clients who want to buy a strategy. And I have to manage this very delicate balance between what different segments of my audience want. And I think if you build up a track record, you become known, and that's where platforms like Twitter are exceptionally useful. If people get to know you as a person, if they get to know a brand as a person, they're much more likely to forgive you when inevitably you make a misstep, because we all do, we're human. It is impossible to always do everything right. And I like to think often of social media and personal branding as buying forgiveness in advance for when you need it.
Yeah, so hopefully, Jenny, you'll be forgiving Garth for his comments on Cape Townians, and I won't ask you what brand image he's left you with. Let's move on to the question he asked, though. How many brands, how many personal brands, Jenny, can South Africa actually create? Or when do we get to a stage where we're looking at a saturated market?
I think everybody needs to create a personal brand. I don't think it's about how much the market can cope with. I think all professional people need to package themselves, and it's the authentic, enduring brand that survives. And particularly now in a soft economy, people can't afford to take risks, so they will always take the best that they can afford. So that's why those who are professional and who have marketed themselves for what they're really good at, they're the ones who do really well. So I think everybody has to make the effort to put a personal brand plan in place, and that plan needs to be hinged on two things. It's credibility and visibility. So you can't try and become known for something that you're not outstanding at, because you won't be called an expert. But if you do what you're suited to, you do what your strengths dictate you should be doing, you will then define your brand, and it will be enduring.
We've been talking very broad strokes, though, Jenny. Where do you start in actually creating and building your brand?
I think it's exactly the same whether it's a commercial brand or a personal brand. You start by saying, what is the brief? What do I want to achieve? And secondly, what is the budget? And that's when you look at your resources. So for an individual, I would say, let's put a balance sheet in place. Let's say, what are the assets? What are your strengths? What are your liabilities? What should you not be doing? And then the third thing to look at would be perceptions. How do people see you? Do they see you for what you want to be seen as? Are you making sure that building your brand is taking what's inside out to the outer world? Because so many people work really hard at whatever their line of business is, but they're not actually leveraging their strengths. So to be very focused on spending all your time doing what you should be doing, rather than doing things that you're not best suited to. And then looking at where your potential lies, because any good brand, however successful it may be, will need to re-innovate, not just for the sake of re-innovating, but to stay ahead of the game. And life is competitive. What makes a good personal brand different and distinctive is actually the personality, and that's you. So getting to know people, building good solid relationships with others in business is how you're going to sustain whatever is thrown at you, and how you're going to keep your brand enduring.
Just a quick question for Sarah and Jenny. How do you measure if your brand is successful or not? And I kind of had a mini debate with Bruce Whitfield the other day, because he put out this tweet, or he put out this idea that if you take the amount of tweets that you put out and divide it by your followers, you get some sort of ratio on how much sense you're talking. And I sort of shot back and said, well, look at the cast of the Jersey Shore. They've all got millions of Twitter followers. At the same time, they're probably quite rich. So I mean, how do you measure the strength of your brand? Do Twitter followers really matter? How do you guys sort of assess that?
Well, Twitter followers have become less meaningful ever since we've discovered that it's possible to buy them. and there's a whole new secondary market. In fact, I wonder if buying Twitter followers, it would be a better investment than wine, actually. But yeah, that's the thing with measurement, is you can game the system. We have something called clout scores, which some people place great store by, and it's said that in Silicon Valley, if your clout score is below a particular number, you will not get invited for a job interview. So in some parts of the world, your clout score is really important. For others, it's the number of Twitter followers. It might be your conversion ratio. There are all sorts of different ways of measuring. For me, it's about how much enjoyment I derive from Twitter, how many followers I'm able to engage with, the relationships that I'm able to build. Now, that's soft stuff, and that's hard to measure. So I'm wary of us measuring ourselves into a coma. I think we can take this thing that is breathing and living and quite difficult to pin down, and by trying to measure it beyond the point where it's meaningful, we can destroy it. And it is about people, it's about relationships. That's tough to measure. That's why it freaks out so many corporate clients, that you can't measure it to the degree that you can measure a sale.
Yeah, I mean, I can give an example of that in South Africa. So, in Cape Town, there's this sort of startup tech community, and they are they're a very big backpatting group. I mean, they all know each other, and they all retweet each other's stuff, but they're only the outside links beyond this community are very poor, and that's why a lot of those businesses, while they might be famous for the fact that they may be starting up something in 5 months' time or whatever, they don't ever get out the starting blocks and build the relationships that they should be. Whereas the businesses that have done well around that ecosystem are those who actually have relationships within the industry. They're not famous for being part of the startup community. They're famous because, or I'm using famous as a broad word, they actually have relationships in banking or financial services or food or whatever it is. Yeah. They actually have real relationships where you can go and you can pick up the phone and you can do it. And I think that's the problem with a lot of social media is they, I don't know, I've got 400 Facebook friends. Does that mean I'm a popular person versus somebody who's got 100? I mean, it's easy just to say, I accept you as a friend. And I think that's one of the problems is it's quality over quantity.